All right, here we go, guys. We're going to continue our discussion of how agriculture varies over space by looking now at commercial agricultural regions. First one we're going to take a look at is the most common form of commercial agriculture in the United States, known as mixed crop and livestock farming, or also known as diversified farming, whereby farmers integrate both crops and livestock into their farm. This is commonly done, and most commonly done, for the purpose of feeding those crops directly to the animals themselves. There's also examples of sort of more symbiotic relationships. So sometimes a farmer will utilize animals that will benefit the crops in some way, or vice versa. But the vast majority of the time, these crops are grown for the purpose of feeding the animals. I showed you here the general region of the United States where most mixed crop and livestock agriculture happens. I also noted here that soybeans or corn are the most commonly used crops to feed directly to livestock. I'm going to return to that momentarily when we talk about grain farming. The reason why farmers do this is there's several reasons why. Bottom line is this can mixed crop and livestock farming can help increase the profits for a farmer because the farmer is able to better distribute his workload across the course of an entire year. And typically in farming, there's a cyclical nature to the work. There's the planting, the harvesting, the clearing the fields, just sort of in a cyclical nature. What the mixed crop and livestock allows the farmer to do is to, in the periods of time during which the farmer is not directly addressing the crops, he can also address the needs of the livestock, which means that the farmer's profit is not just limited to the time of harvest. There's again a longer period of time during which the farmer can make money and then can also distribute the workload. See here, let's just pretend for a moment here that the corn that those cows are eating down in the picture below was grown on the farm, because then that demonstrates that the cows are directly eating that corn. Or alternatively, in this top right hand corner, we see sheep in the Netherlands that are grazing underneath fruit trees. So we've got the both the product of the tree and the livestock itself on the same farm. Dairying. Dairying is a type of agriculture that is reflective of development in other words, reflective of a more developed country, because it's an expensive endeavor. The amount of equipment that's required for dairying, and more importantly, the refrigeration that's necessary for dairying to be successful, is also another added expense. So dairy farms, for those reasons, we already talked about this for the Von Thunen model, that the dairy farms are located close to the population centers. So it's going to be in one of the first ring of Von Thunen's model. And there's a term to describe that. The term to describe sort of the constraints that are placed upon dairying. And the term is milk shed. The milk shed is the ring extending from the farm where the milk can be delivered without spoiling. Now, this is a little bit of an antiquated means out of date. It's a little bit of an antiquated term because with modern technology and modern refrigeration, the milk can travel much greater distances. But the concept of the milk shed, or the concept that the concept of the milk shed and the concept of dairy farm still has to be relatively close to the population center, is not wrong. I mean, I mentioned this already, but I'm sure many of you have gone to the store before, and your family member has probably said to you, check the date on the milk before you buy it to ensure that the milk that you buy is fresh, and that, obviously as consumers we want to maximize our own money, so we're going to buy products that are fresh for the longest period of time. So even though we can physically carry the milk a lot farther and physically carry the dairy products a lot farther with refrigeration, the concept that there's still a milk shed, is still a region from which the milk can most profitably travel, is still relevant. Because of this concept of the milk shed, butter and cheese tend to be produced farther away from cities. So if a dairying farm is not close to a population center, they have to travel very far to get to, say, a city or a larger town, then it's more likely that will be a butter and cheese producing dairy farm, because the butter and the cheese can travel much farther and there's maximized profit for the farmer. So you can see here, if this was milk shed A and milk shed B, you see the C for the city and T for a town. The city has a little bit larger of a milk shed, and you see that the town, just the ring around the town, would be the corresponding concept of a milk shed. This is as far away as the dairy farms would want to be. Again, theoretical model, but concept that a dairy farm has only but so far to go, specifically for the production of milk, is accurate. With the dairying, another reason why it's so particularly expensive is because it's labor intensive. So because dairy farms require, I mean, cows need to be milked, and there's a lot of labor involved in the production of dairy products such as cheese and butter and yogurt. These dairy farms are expensive to maintain, but they become increasingly more productive with the growth of agribusinesses. So as agribusinesses are growing, the number of dairy farms actually goes down because they're all being consolidated, put together into one, but the production's going up. So if you look over here on the right hand side, you see the value that they're actually, is that the map I'm looking for? Well, that's okay. So bottom line here is just that the agribusiness number of dairy farms themselves is going down, but production of dairy products is going up because agribusiness is making the process more mechanized and more efficient in some senses of the term. You notice here that milk, this where milk is produced, is the top map right there, and you'll notice that it's closer to some of the population centers. But cheese can be much far. The milk is more widely distributed. In other words, the farms that are present in that top map, you'll notice that there are more of them because milk needs to be closer to population. Whereas if you look down to the bottom map, the farms are much more concentrated because cheese can be shipped farther away, so they don't have to be located as close to the population. Another type of commercial farming, this is sort of the corollary to pastoral nomadism and LDCs. So for MDCs, we find in our commercial farming regions, we find ranching. Ranching is typical of a semi-arid and arid climates, which makes perfect sense because we've already talked about this, that their land is dry, so we maximize its use with ranching rather than trying to unsuccessfully producing agriculture on a large scale. Ranching is practiced over a very large area, needs a lot of land to be successful because the animals themselves need to graze. And that therefore, because of that fact right there, practiced over a very large area of land, it's referred to as extensive agriculture, needing a lot of space to be successful. And sometimes the ranchers own the land, sometimes ranchers lease the land from the government. So the relationship between ranching and the physical land and the physical territory is not necessarily always the same. Those of you who are taking U.S. history or will take U.S. history with me in 11th grade, we're going to talk a lot about this concept of the relationship between cattle ranchers in the U.S. and the land. But on the whole, the land that the ranchers use is sometimes owned by the ranchers themselves, sometimes is not. One of the problems associated with the need for land, as it's all coming together now, if we need more land, that becomes more problematic when there's greater population and greater development. So as ranchers lose land or lose access to the land, they have to operate on a smaller and smaller territory. Consequently, the animals start to overgraze, and then what that will lead to is topsoil loss. Topsoil is the top layer of the soil that's fertile. But if the animals continue to graze and continue to graze, just like we talked about with monoculture, continue to farm, that topsoil the topsoil will be lost, leading the soil to become unfertile, and thus in turn causing desertification. So as ranchers lose land and they don't have as much land to operate on, that can in turn have some environmental impacts. You'll notice here that ranching, these are the most common types of, these are the most common animals that are produced through ranching, the meat production as you see here. Europe has a low concentration of ranching because European society is a very urbanized society and there's not a lot of available land, so ranching is not as common in Europe. An area of the world where it is common or was common but is increasingly becoming less common is the area in South America known as the Pampas. And the Pampas are these vast grassland areas with very rich soil in South America that were used for ranching. But the ranching is they're increasingly losing land, and the Pampas are increasingly facing some of the environmental impacts that were just discussed with overgrazing and desertification as a result. There are some criticisms of ranching in particular. I'm actually going to stop this for a second so we can look at this chart right here. That if you see here, the global demand for meat is rising. That's a terrible movement. I'm sorry about that. But generally speaking, you see here that we are the global demand 2005 versus the projected demands in 2050. The entire world is demanding more meat, and the entire world is eating more meat. So if you see it on here, I'm going to move this back now. One of the problems with our global demand for meat, and you can see actually, look at the United States, look how much poultry we consume. I mean, the entire world is consuming more and more meat. And actually, I'm going to move this one over again because you can see that one of the big areas of the world that's driving, oh, it's not even on here. Well, one of the big areas of the world that's driving a lot of the current meat production is China. The Chinese diet has been increasingly including red meat. And that's driving a lot of the demand for global ranching. But it's not just China. That's not to just simply pin this on China in any way, shape, or form. The entire world is eating more and more and more meat, and what that means, though, is that the one of the criticisms or one of the problems of that meat demand is that it takes a tremendous amount of resources, both water and food, to produce 1 pound of meat. In particular, red meat. So, what I mentioned when we talked at the beginning about mixed crop and livestock farming, there's a direct connection between this global demand for meat and the next type of farming we're going to discuss, which is grain farming. Because, actually, oh, look at that. I had that already planned ahead. Well, here you go. Zoomed in map again. You can just see the global demand for meat. But that one that you need to keep in mind is that one on the bottom left, where you see that projected increase in the amount of meat that we're demanding. In turn, that is driving the growth of our grain farming. I mentioned again that such a large percentage of the crops that are grown in the United States are not even grown for people; they're grown for animals. And there's the definition of grain farming is the growing of grain for human consumption, but so much of the grain is actually going that we produce is used for animal feed. So one of the biggest things is that we have is wheat. Okay, wheat is a high value. Actually, let me back that up for a second. The mixed crop and livestock farming is specifically the grain is going specifically to the animals, whereas in commercial farming and grain farming, that grain is being grown for the purpose of feeding humans. Okay, so with that, the one of the most common grains that is produced, particularly in the United States, is wheat. And wheat is a high value crop and it's cheap to transport. It can be used in many, many different ways. If you think about what you eat on a daily basis, odds are good that a lot of that came from wheat, or at least part of that came from wheat. So that what's one of the most commonly grown crops in the United States is wheat. China is actually the greatest wheat producer, but the United States is the greatest wheat exporter. So the wheat exports around the world are actually one of the ways in which the United States provides aid to lesser developed countries of the world. So China is the greatest wheat producer, but the U.S. is the greatest wheat exporter, sort of a reflection of the mechanization and the large production of wheat that the United States can do. And then you can see here that for corn, that both China and the U.S. are the largest producers, but most corn is being used for feed for animals versus actual human consumption with this grain farming. You can see here where that's actually happening in the United States. That's being concentrated in the Corn Belt region of the United States. So the Midwest region, same one that we looked at the beginning of the video. And let's keep going here. There's actually two different types of wheat that are grown. There's something called winter wheat and spring wheat, just a reflection of when it is, when the wheat is actually harvested. Winter wheat is primarily grown in Kansas, Colorado, and Nebraska, whereas the spring wheat is grown primarily in the Dakotas and Montana. And you can see here the areas of the world where we have sort of large connections for net imports and net exports of grain and for food. We're going to talk about this at a greater length in class. I'm going to hold off on that for a little bit. Another type of commercial farming is known as truck farming. I can't go further without saying that truck farming has nothing to do with trucks. Nothing to do with it. Truck is a old term to refer to bartering, which means trading goods, one good for another. And truck farming is actually just commercial gardening and fruit farming. So this is the growing of fruits and vegetables. 3 different phrases to generally say the growing of fruits and vegetables. But truck farming has nothing to do with trucks. Nothing. I mean, at some point, the food may end up on trucks, but that is not why it's called truck farming. Just a reference to the fact that people used to trade one good for another, one fruit for another, one vegetable for another, so on and so forth. Anyway, the crops that are grown in truck farming or commercial gardening and fruit farming are high profit crops. So they're high profit fruit and vegetables. These are often known as specialty crops. So these are the ones that are typically demanded by urban populations. So the ones that people like you and I in cities, when we go to buy our produce, that's a reflection of commercial gardening and fruit farming. These processes are highly mechanized, and the prices of these goods are often kept even lower through the reuse of migrant labor. So, migrant labor helps drive down the costs that are associated with these crops because much of these specialty crops, all of these specialty crops are highly perishable. So, they're sort of important to keep to maximize profits in this way. Truck farming is primarily present, or commercial gardening is primarily present in the United States in the Southeast, in New England, and near cities around the world. So again, the von Thunen model concept still applies, that the perishable nature of these fruits and vegetables means that people must keep them close to population centers. Another key example of this is actually another key example of commercial farming that's relevant in the United States is in Central California, in the Salinas County in California. It's known as the salad bowl of the world because that's where a large percentage of the world's lettuce is produced. Two more to go. One more is another type of agriculture is called Mediterranean agriculture, and this is the growth of specialty crops in Mediterranean climate. So the Mediterranean, of course, is a reference to the Mediterranean Sea, but there are other areas of the world that share similar climate characteristics, which are shown on the map on the top right hand side. Many people, the one that many people are familiar with is Napa Valley in Southern California. So these specialty crops are particularly special in that the specialty crops are unique or depend upon an environment that is beneficial to be close to the sea. And we'll talk about what those specifically are. Some of the areas of the world where we find that are the Mediterranean, Southern California, Oregon, South Africa, and Chile. This is primarily the growth of horticulture, which is the growing of fresh fruits, vegetables, and flowers. So the horticulture of growing fresh fruits, vegetables, and flowers, again, highly perishable, but also highly valuable crops. Specifically with Mediterranean agriculture, the most high value crops are grapes and olives because grapes are used for wine and olives are made for olive oil. So other kinds of nuts are often grown in Mediterranean climates. It's quite effective for the crops that need a lot of sun and those offshore breezes. And this is also a high value, as I mentioned, high profit crop. Okay, plantation agriculture. Plantation agriculture is unique because I'm qualifying it as a type of commercial farming, but it occurs in least developed countries of the world, or lesser developed countries of the world. Plantation agriculture, by definition, is the large-scale farming of crops that are unable to be grown in Europe or the United States or other regions. These are specifically cash crops. In other words, the farmer's growing these for the specific purpose of selling that crop. I'm going to jump down to the third bullet point for a minute. Typically, this leads to what's called monoculture, the cultivation of a single crop. So rather than a farmer growing multiple crops, the farmer is going to focus on the type of crop that's going to generate the greatest profit and for being sold and back to the MDCs. So as I mentioned, this occurs in lesser developed countries of the world, typically in the tropical lowlands, so that equatorial region that we've discussed already for shifting cultivation. This would be the commercial agricultural corollary, that rather than shifting cultivation, which is for subsistence agriculture, feeding the people just who are participating in the agriculture, this plantation agriculture is occurring in the same climates, but is actually being done to 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 then export those cash crops to the most developed countries of the world. Again, this is largely defined by what's called monoculture, so the cultivation of just a single crop as opposed to a large number of crops. I apologize, there's a repetition right there for the production of specialty crops grown in LDCs and exported to MDCs. The types of crops that this is just a sampling, a little sprinkling of the types of crops, but some examples are peanuts, pineapples, bananas, sugarcane, cotton, rubber, tea, coconuts. This is one of the common criticisms, and this is something we're going to spend next couple classes looking at, is that plantation agriculture is very economically productive and provides jobs for people. It often can drive development of a country because the farmers themselves are gaining Not just not they're not just selling their crops; they're also often getting they're getting quite wealthy from the production and their sale of these crops. However, a lot of people criticize plantation agriculture because this loops back to our discussion about neocolonialism. This is one of the common arguments used for the concept that MDCs or the LDCs are still economically dependent upon MDCs, as the LDCs are producing the good, but it's largely being sold in MDCs. Another thing the AP exam mentioned a couple years ago is the discussion of, or maybe it was AP review, regardless, from those two, that the idea that the farmer is creating, it's that the plantation agricultural systems often create social systems in the LDCs where the farmers who participate in commercial agriculture are becoming increasingly wealthy, but the people who are not are becoming poorer. So we're going to break down that argument a bit. Okay, here are your analysis questions for our commercial agricultural region. So go ahead and pause here and we'll take it from there. Thanks.